The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound like electricity trapped in glass, as Natalie Hayes walked through the automatic doors of St. Michael's Hospital at 2,206 hours. 8 months. That's how long she'd been here, pushing through night shifts with the same measured pace she'd maintained through worse situations than this place would ever dream of throwing at her. The antiseptic smell hit first, that familiar blend of bleach and something chemical that never quite masked the underlying scent of human suffering. Cold stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white light. The ER nurse's station was a controlled chaos of beeping monitors and clicking keyboards. She clocked in without fanfare, her badge clipping against her ribs with a soft metallic sound. Nobody looked up. Nobody ever did. Her scrubs were faded blue, washed so many times the fabric had gone thin at the seams. She'd chosen the same size every rotation for months now, finding comfort in the familiar weight of them, the way they moved like a second skin that remembered what the first one had survived. Her hands, those were the giveaway if anyone ever bothered to look closely. Scarred along the knuckles. A thin white line running from her wrist to her elbow on the left side. Calluses in all the wrong places for a civilian nurse. But people didn't look. People never looked at the quiet ones. She made her way to the ICU corridor where the night stretched ahead like it always did. 16 patients. 14 monitors. 3 of them in serious decline. She knew this the way some people knew their own heartbeat, not from checking charts, but from something deeper. Intuition. Or maybe just muscle memory from holding things together when the alternative was watching them fall apart. The hallway lights flickered once, steadied themselves. Rain began to tap against the windows, a soft percussion that would probably build into something harder before dawn broke over San Antonio. Room for 47 was 2 corridors over. She didn't know that yet. She was still 30 minutes away from that room, 30 minutes away from the moment that would rewire everything, but right now she was focused on Mrs. Chen in 441, whose oxygen saturation numbers had been drifting downward for the past 4 hours. The kind of drift nobody else noticed because they were looking at the big emergencies, the dramatic crashes. Natalie had learned long ago that the quiet deterioration was often more dangerous than the spectacular one. The quiet ones had no announcements. She was reviewing the Chen chart at the station when Dr. Marcus Pierce arrived for morning rounds at 0738 hours. Tall. Expensive watch, the Rolex Submariner that caught the light as he moved. His white coat was pristine, pressed with the kind of care that suggested he didn't actually treat patients so much as coordinate their treatment from a position of authority. He'd been at St. Michael's for 3 years. Natalie had been invisible to him for 7 months and 23 days until she'd questioned a medication order, a dosage that didn't match the patient profile, a 3-day ICU admission that would net the hospital $42,000 on a Medicare diagnosis code that didn't quite justify the stay. She'd asked him about it in the medication room, quietly, without an audience. He'd gone very still. Then he'd smiled, and the smile had looked like something a reptile would make. "Grand rounds," he announced, his voice carrying down the corridor with the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned twice about the same thing. "I want all available residents and nursing staff in the conference room in 15 minutes. Natalie finished her notation on Mrs. Chen's chart. The O2 sat was now at 88%. She adjusted the nasal cannula and moved on. The conference room was white walls and uncomfortable chairs arranged in a horseshoe. 23 residents in various stages of sleep deprivation. 3 attending physicians. 2 physicians' assistants. Natalie stood in the back, her arms folded, the small silver pin on her chest, barely visible, just a scratch of metal that caught light from certain angles, tucked under her scrubs where nobody could see it. The pin had been made from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel. It meant something specific to people who knew. People didn't know. Dr. Pierce entered with a folder. He opened it with deliberate slowness, his movements theatrical in a way that made the room settle into attention. He'd pulled out a patient chart. Natalie recognized it immediately. Mrs. Ramirez from Tuesday night. The notation was hers. The assessment and care plan, completely standard protocol for a post-surgical patient with stable vitals and clear trending. but Pierce was holding it up like it was evidence of negligence. "This," he said, turning the chart so the residents could see it, "is what happens when we allow outdated protocols to persist in a modern ICU. Dangerously outdated thinking. The kind of clinical judgment that belongs in a field hospital in 2003, not in a level 1 trauma center in 2024. He let the word sit. Let them breathe. The residents were scribbling notes now, looking at Natalie. She felt the weight of their attention but didn't react. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing stayed even. Her hands stayed exactly where they were. This assessment was conducted by one of our night shift nurses. No criticism intended, but we need to discuss how this kind of thinking creates liability for St. Michael's. He was describing standard post-operative monitoring. Vitals every 2 hours. Neurochecks every 4. Pain assessment and management. Respiratory status tracking. Every single notation was textbook. Every single one was correct. But the way he was saying it, the tone in his voice, it was the tone people used when describing incompetence. The residents were looking at each other now with that particular expression that said they'd filed this away, that they would remember her as the nurse who didn't know modern protocols, that somewhere in their future practices, if they ran into her at a conference or a hospital transfer, they would remember Pierce saying her name next to the word outdated. He closed the chart. Smiled at her. "Thank you for being here so we can learn from this." The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that came from watching someone be dismantled in front of an audience. Natalie's hands moved to adjust her badge. That was all. One small movement. She didn't look away. She didn't look down. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then returned her attention to Mrs. Chen's chart, which she was still holding. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and even. Mrs. Chen's O2 sat is drifting. No apology. No explanation. No defense. Just the fact. Just the thing that mattered. And she turned and walked out of the conference room before anyone could respond, her footsteps echoing down the corridor in a rhythm that didn't waver. She was back at room 441 when the news arrived. A telephone call, relayed by the unit secretary. General William Marsh, 84 years old, emergency cardiac surgery overnight, transferred to room 447 for post-operative monitoring. Recovering well from the procedure. Stable vitals. Expected to wake within 48 hours. Natalie didn't remember crossing the corridor. She didn't remember the moment she pulled his chart or the moment she read the name. She just knew, suddenly, that she was holding a piece of paper that had Marsh, General William, USMC, Ret, written across the top, and the world had become very small and very specific and focused on a single point. 3 weeks ago, her son had come home in a flag. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, 29, killed in action in the Hindu Kush. The ceremony had been clean and military and precise, and there had been a general there, a man with shoulders broad as doorways and medals running the length of his chest. He'd looked her in the eyes, really looked at her, not through her like most people did, and he'd pinned a silver star on her son's uniform. Posthumous decoration. That was the phrase they used. As if honor could make up for the fact that the body in the casket was no longer the person who'd earned it. She walked to her locker at the end of the shift. The locker was 7 inches wide and 4 feet high, just enough space for the small things people accumulated during work hours. A backup pair of shoes. A water bottle. A granola bar that had been there for 6 weeks. And in the far corner, wrapped in a t-shirt that had once been worn in Kabul by someone she'd known every day of his life, a folded flag. She touched it once. Just once. Her fingertip against the fabric. The flag felt the way grief always felt to her, like something solid enough to hold but not solid enough to fix. She didn't cry. Crying was for people who got to go home and process and fall apart. She was still on duty. Mrs. Chen still needed monitoring. The general would be waking in 23 hours, give or take, and his post-operative care needed someone who understood the difference between standard protocol and actually keeping a patient alive. She wrapped her hand around the flag one more time, feeling the weight of it, 7 pounds of folded tradition that meant everything to everyone and nothing to no one. Then she closed the locker and turned back toward the wards where the night shift was waiting for her to hold it together like she always did. The vending machine's fluorescent glow cast everything in hospital white as Dr. Pierce fed dollar bills into the slot with the care of a man counting money that wasn't his. Natalie stood 3 feet away, waiting for the coffee that would get her through the next 8 hours, and that's when she heard his voice rise, deliberate, pitched just loud enough for the 2 residents at his shoulder to catch every word. I mean, did she even finish nursing school? Because her charting on that Medicare admission yesterday, he shook his head, extracting a bottled water with theatrical precision. Looked like something written during a psych evaluation. Documentation that sloppy creates liability. Real liability. The residents laughed. One of them glanced at Natalie. She didn't acknowledge the look. Her coffee dropped into the bin below the slot with a soft thunk. She pressed the cup against her palm, feeling the heat transfer into her skin, a small anchor, a grounding detail. Pain is information. She'd learned that a long time ago in mountains that didn't exist on any map she could show these people. She turned and walked past all 3 of them. Her pace didn't quicken. Her shoulders didn't tense. If her jaw had clenched, only someone trained to read micro-expressions would have noticed. Dr. Pierce watched her go with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd landed a clean hit. He hadn't. Not the way he thought. The shift deepened into its quiet hours. Natalie moved through the wards with the measured rhythm that had carried her through 8 months of institutional invisibility. Chart notes written with precision. Vitals checked on a schedule that preceded medical necessity. The kind of work that left no room for criticism if someone actually read it, which Pierce hadn't. He'd skimmed her documentation on the Medicare patient, seen the dosage he'd wanted to escalate himself, and decided that pointing out her competence would only complicate things. Better to simply plant the seed that she couldn't be trusted. At 2:13 a.m., she was in the medication room restocking the crash cart when Security Director Chen appeared in the doorway with the casual demeanor of a man delivering a message that wasn't actually his to deliver. His uniform was pressed. His name tag aligned perfectly with the center of his chest. Dr. Pierce just cooled down, Chen said, not entering the room, keeping a measured distance. He's concerned about some staffing protocols. Thinks maybe we should consider a security escort policy for certain employees when they leave the facility. Problem employees sometimes need supervision, he said. For everyone's safety. Natalie's hands continued their work. She was arranging a 14-gauge angiocath needle into its designated slot in the emergency kit, each movement exact and deliberate. The implications of what he'd just said threaded through the room like electrical current. He mentioned it might be worth checking your references, Chen continued, and now there was an apology in his tone, the sound of a man who'd already decided he didn't want to be part of what was coming. Just to be thorough. You understand. She understood perfectly. Security escort meant a public perception of danger. References meant a phone call to people she'd told never to acknowledge knowing her. References meant the careful erasure that had protected her for 4 years, since the day a Pentagon attorney had informed her that Operation Copper Summit had been reclassified retroactively, that her service records had been deleted from every database that mattered, that her discharge papers would reflect a false date, that she should never surface again. She closed the crash cart drawer and turned to face Chen, and something in the geometry of her posture made him take a small step backward, even though she hadn't moved toward him. She held his eyes for 3 seconds. Then she nodded. Understood, she said. I'll let him know I spoke with you, Chen offered, and the relief in his voice was genuine. He left. Natalie stood alone in the medication room surrounded by the tools of rescue. She picked up a pair of trauma shears from the supply drawer, the stainless steel cool against her fingertips. The handles were worn smooth from use, not hers, but someone's. She turned them over in her palm, noting the weight distribution, the balance point. Then she set them down and checked the wall clock, 2:38 a.m. By the time Pierce made his next move, Natalie had already finished her rounds and was standing at the nursing station reviewing the charting on a post-operative patient in room for 47. General William Marsh. 73 years old. Emergency cardiac surgery 72 hours ago. The man whose voice had recommended her son for the Silver Star recommendation before her son died in a place she still wasn't supposed to talk about. The chart was stable. Vitals normal. Recovery trajectory exactly as it should be. She was making notes when Dr. Pierce appeared at the counter with her documentation from the previous shift, the Medicare admission he'd called out at the vending machine. He held the paper like evidence in a courtroom he'd already rigged. "This dosage here," Pierce said, tapping the line with his index finger. His voice carried an undertone of physician-to-resident instruction, designed so nearby staff would hear. This is precisely the kind of decision-making that ends careers. The patient's renal function didn't support this protocol. A competent nurse would have flagged it for clarification. The resident he'd brought with him, a young man no older than 26, looked at Natalie with a mixture of sympathy and distance, the expression of someone watching a car accident and hoping it doesn't spread. Natalie didn't argue. She didn't explain. She did something far more effective. She looked at the chart, then at Pierce, and said nothing. Held his gaze for just long enough to make him realize she wasn't going to give him the reaction he was calculating for. Her hand was steady on the pen she'd been holding. Her breathing was even. The slight tightness in her jaw was barely perceptible, a single muscle fiber responding to stimuli and then releasing. Pierce waited for 3 seconds. For some indication of defensiveness, of frustration, of fear. When none came, when Natalie simply turned back to her charting as if he'd asked her to pass the salt, his face flushed with something that looked like anger but was actually desperation. He'd expected to break something open in her presentation, and instead he'd broken something in himself. He walked away without finishing what he'd started to say. Natalie completed her documentation on room for 47 with the same precision she brought to everything. The general was sleeping. The monitor beside his bed displayed a cardiac rhythm that was solid, reliable, a heart that would beat through the night without incident if the world cooperated. She updated his fluid intake and output, double-checked his medication drip rates, and moved to the next patient. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Pierce had set in motion the moment he decided she was a threat to something he valued more than his oath. The night deepened. The ER remained quiet in that particular way of hospital midnights, the kind of quiet that feels borrowed, provisional, holding its breath. Natalie was charting in the ICU when the overhead system crackled to life at 3:06 a.m. with the call that changed the temperature of everything: incoming mass casualty. ETA 6 minutes. Medevac from Fort Sam, Houston. 7 casualties, multiple GSWs. All trauma protocols activate. Gunshot wounds. Military. Which meant this wasn't a drunk college student or a neighborhood altercation. This meant the world outside had finally found its way in. The emergency department transformed in the span of a single breath. Monitors were powered up. Equipment was staged. The trauma surgeons arrived looking alert in that particular way of physicians who've had sleep interrupted but maintain the fiction of being ready. Dr. Pierce appeared from the on-call room, buttoning his shirt, moving with the confidence of someone who assumed chaos was simply an opportunity for him to demonstrate superior skill. The helicopters arrived before the warning. The rotor wash slammed against the hospital's east-facing windows hard enough that a coffee cup fell from the second-floor supply room. The stretchers came through the trauma bay entrance in rapid sequence. 7 patients. 3 critical. 2 urgent. 2 walking wounded. Military fatigues. Blood on tan fabric like rust on canvas. The smell of diesel fuel and copper and fear. Natalie moved with the team, her movements automatic and precise as she helped transfer the first patient, a Marine with a through-and-through abdominal GSW and arterial bleeding that needed tamponade before he'd survive transport to the OR. The team moved around him like a choreography they'd rehearsed. Dr. Pierce was calling for an 18-gauge needle. Someone was running labs. A resident was trying to establish a central line in the patient's groin. The resident's hands trembled slightly. Natalie watched him miss the landmark twice, the needle sliding past the femoral artery instead of entering it. The third attempt would blow through the back wall. Pain is data. Panic is inefficiency. She saw it clearly in the way his shoulders were held, the shallow breathing, the loss of his centering. Pierce was calling for the ultrasound when the patient's blood pressure dropped like a stone falling down a well. 60/30 and dropping. The monitor screamed its electronic alarm in a frequency designed to trigger every stress response the human nervous system possessed. "We're losing him," someone said. Natalie's hands moved before her mind caught up with what they were doing. 30 years of training that officially didn't exist, that had been erased from every file, that she wasn't supposed to remember anymore, it woke up in her muscle memory like a creature opening its eyes. She steadied the resident's hands. She guided the needle. She felt the arterial puncture register through the needle's hub, the blood flash appearing in the catheter in a way that meant they'd found the vessel. She threaded the guide wire through, felt its familiar resistance and give, and by the time Dr. Pierce looked over to understand what had just happened, the central line was in and they were transfusing blood products through a pressure bag that was already climbing the patient's vital signs like a ladder. "Who authorized that?" Pierce's voice cut through the controlled chaos. But the patient's blood pressure was 102/68 now. The patient was pink, perfused, alive. The team moved him toward the operating room. And Natalie stepped back from the trauma bay with her hands at her sides, feeling the shake she wouldn't allow to reach her surface, the adrenaline that had transformed her from a tired night shift nurse into something else entirely, something that moved like muscle memory and spoke in a language of trauma medicine that these residents would spend years learning. She didn't meet anyone's eyes. She simply returned to the secondary patients, the ones with injuries that could wait 5 minutes, and kept working with the steady hands that had held lives together in places where there was no OR waiting, no backup team, no hospital system designed to catch people falling. And that's when the general's heart went wrong. The alarm came at 0306. One blast, then continuous. The monitor above General Marsh's bed transformed into chaos, the steady blip becoming a frantic scream that pulled every head in the ICU toward room for 47. Natalie moved before thinking, muscle memory older than her nursing license carrying her through the doorway as the resident on call froze, staring at the flat line with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. General Marsh's chest heaved once, twice, then stopped. His skin had gone the color of wet concrete. The ventilator kept pushing air into lungs that couldn't move it anymore, a metronome for a body in arrest. Natalie's eyes found the clock. 0306, she ran the calculation without effort, surgical team was 20 minutes minimum. Maybe more. The OR was 3 floors up. They'd need to intubate, prep, scrub in. 20 minutes was a funeral with a flat line. She knew this the way she knew how to tie a tourniquet without looking. "Get me a defibrillator pad," she said to the resident, whose name she still couldn't remember after 8 months. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a question. Not a request. He moved. Started moving. The others followed, the charge nurse, the LPN, the respiratory therapist who'd been checking ventilators at the far end of the unit. They didn't question why she was giving orders. They just obeyed. In crisis, people follow whoever sounds like they've been here before. But Natalie's mind had already left San Antonio. The Hindu Kush materialized around her with the clarity of a photograph. Not a memory, a muscle memory. Sanjan Valley, 2014. Combat Aid Station Kilo, held by 4 medics and 1 captain with a field kit designed for 30 minutes of casualty load that lasted 11 hours. She could smell the dust, feel the weight of the .338 round that had creased her ribs and left a scar the color of old lightning. Could hear the mortar impacts walking toward the station like a predator counting down. 1 casualty every 4 minutes. No evac birds, all grounded. No surgical backup. Just hands, knowledge, and the kind of quiet that comes from having already accepted you might not leave. The general had walked through that dust to pin a silver star on a captain's uniform 3 weeks before that captain's son died in a Chinook crash 5 kilometers south. Now that general was dying in room for 47. Natalie's hands moved. She didn't watch them, she never did. The crash cart glided toward her like she'd called it by name. defibrillator pads on his chest. The rhythmic compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, the cadence ingrained past thought, past hesitation. Epinephrine drawn. For line established on the second try because her hands didn't shake under pressure. They steadied under pressure. Like everything else, she'd learned that in places where shaking meant somebody died. O2 sat 72 and dropping, the respiratory therapist called out. The general's heart wasn't responding. The monitor showed the flat line continuing its indifferent scream. Not fibrillation. Not something that electricity could jolt back to life. Something worse. Something mechanical. The fluids running weren't filling his lungs because something was compressing his heart from the outside, collapsing it, squeezing the life out of it like a fist closing around a bird. Pericardial tamponade. Fluid around the heart. Post-surgical complication. Catastrophic. Fatal in 20 minutes without intervention. Natalie reached up and unlatched the crash cart surgical kit without asking permission. The sterile field. The scalpel blade, still in its packaging. Her fingers knew exactly where to go, left lateral thorax, fifth intercostal space, between the ribs where the anatomy opened like a door. She'd done this 4 times under fire. Once with mortar rounds impacting 60 meters out. Once with a patient who'd already taken a rifle round through the same location. Once with nothing but field dressings and a prayer that sounded more like a tactical grid coordinate. "What are you doing?" The resident's voice cracked up 2 octaves. "Save his life. Get me a 14-gauge needle if we have one, or prep for emergency thoracotomy." It wasn't a request. The room knew it. The words carried the weight of someone who'd given that exact command when people's lives depended on obedience, not clarification. When stopping to explain meant someone died on a stretcher while you talked about protocols. She didn't wait for the needle. Her hands had already made the incision, clean, precise, the blade moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd practiced this on mannequins and then practiced for real on the kind of patients where there was no second take, no do-over, just the absolute knowledge that your hands either worked or a human being stopped being human. The hiss of air escaping. Fluid under pressure, nearly black, releasing like a sigh. "Syringe," she said. Someone placed it in her palm before she finished the word. She drew. The fluid came out in pools that corresponded directly to the monitor above. O2 sat climbing. 75. 80. The general's color starting to shift from concrete gray toward something that resembled blood flow. The heart monitor's flat line beginning to show the faintest rhythm, tentative, like someone waking up from anesthesia. 82. 87. 90. Sinus rhythm establishing itself, the beeping gaining confidence. Vital stabilizing, respiratory called out. BP coming up. 110/68. The room exhaled. Not literally, nobody moved, nobody breathed. But the panic drained out like the fluid she'd pulled from around his heart. The general's chest rose and fell with the ventilator. His pupils reacted. His color continued climbing toward something resembling human. Natalie's hands moved to close the incision, muscle memory taking the wheel again. Surgical knots. Precise. The kind of neat closure that would have made any surgeon proud, the kind that only existed when someone had done this in darkness, in noise, without sterile fields or backup, just the absolute certainty that leaving a wound open meant infection, meant sepsis, meant death. She was tying the final knot when the door opened and Dr. Pierce walked in, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped like a status symbol, his face cycling through expressions that moved from confusion to shock to something darker. He took in the scene. The general stabilized vitals. The surgical site. Natalie's gloved hands, still steady, still competent. The crash cart cleared of its emergency supplies. The monitor showing a heart rate of 88 and climbing. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz. Pierce's jaw moved. Closed. Opened again. His eyes locked on the incision, unauthorized, unordered, performed by someone who absolutely should not know how to perform emergency thoracotomies in an ICU bay using only a crash cart and muscle memory older than her nursing degree. "Get security," he said quietly to the charge nurse. Not a request. A command. Now. He pulled his phone out and walked into the hallway. Natalie heard him dialing before the door swung shut. Heard him say, "This is Dr. Marcus Pierce." "Yes. I need to report a serious incident involving credential fraud and unauthorized surgical procedures." She finished the last knot. Her hand stayed steady. Her breathing remained even. Because she'd been trained by the best killers in the world not to panic when things went wrong, and trained by experience not to show it when the world noticed. But beneath the surface, beneath the composure, something cold and familiar was waking up. The part of her that had killed to protect her unit. The part that had survived things that shouldn't have survived. The part that the Pentagon had ordered to disappear, to become invisible, to never resurface under any circumstances. That part was very awake now. Pierce made 3 phone calls from his office. The first went to the hospital board chairman, a man who'd sent his mother to St. Michael's and owed Pierce referrals worth $40,000 a month. The second went to the Texas Medical Board. Unauthorized surgical procedures. Scope of practice violation. A nurse performing procedures that required a surgeon's license. The third call went to a private investigator he kept on retainer for situations exactly like this. The kind where a problem needed to disappear quietly, with documentation. With proof. With witnesses who would testify if required. Security Director Chen arrived at 0347 with a manila folder and the kind of expression that made it clear this wasn't a conversation. She found Natalie restocking supplies in the ICU, moving with the same measured efficiency she'd maintained for 8 months. Chen gestured toward the hallway. They walked without speaking. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a shade of exhausted white. "Natalie Hayes?" Chen's voice carried no inflection. "Just procedure. Just protocol." "Yes. You're suspended effective immediately. Pending investigation into your credentials." Natalie turned to face her. Chen's eyes wouldn't meet hers, a tell, the kind of thing people who'd spent years in uniform learned to read. Fabricated credentials. Natalie kept her voice level. Steady as a surgical laser. "I need to explain something." "Not required." Chen extended her hand, palm up. "Your badge." "My service records were erased. Operation Copper Summit. When the Pentagon buried it, they buried me." Natalie's voice remained calm, factual. Like she was reading lab results. "Officially I don't exist." "That's not fabrication. That's classified protocol." Chen's jaw tightened. She'd heard enough, not because she believed Natalie, but because she'd been told not to listen. Not to engage. Just to collect the badge and escort her from the building. Those were Pierce's instructions, relayed through 3 layers of administration designed to protect him from liability. "Your badge, please." Natalie unclipped it from her scrubs. The plastic was worn smooth from 8 months of shifts, thousands of hours in sterile corridors. She placed it in Chen's palm without hesitation. Without resistance. The absence of fight was somehow more powerful than any argument would have been. At noon, Natalie returned to the hospital laundry with a canvas bag containing her scrubs. 3 sets. 2 pairs of compression socks. A stethoscope that had been in her locker since day 1. The laundry attendant, a woman named Rodriguez who'd worked there for 14 years, looked up from the washing machine. "That's early." Rodriguez had seen plenty of nurses come and go. The turnover at St. Michael's was worse than most. "You sick?" "Suspended." Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but her hand slowed. She'd worked long enough to know that suspended didn't mean what the administration said it meant. Suspended meant someone had decided you were a problem. Suspended meant your name was already being discussed in board meetings. Natalie began folding the scrubs. The blue fabric was faded from washing, the waistband elastic wearing thin at the edges. She'd put on this uniform 5 days a week for 244 shifts. She'd coded patients in these scrubs. She'd held a general's chest cavity open in this fabric. And now she was folding them for the last time, placing them in a neat stack on the counter while Rodriguez pretended to focus on the washing machine cycle, giving her privacy in the way that people do when they recognize grief. "You saved someone." Rodriguez didn't look at her. "I heard. 2 nights ago. When that Marine came in." Natalie's hands didn't stop folding. "Yes. They're saying he was important. They're saying a lot of things." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the folded stack of scrubs and placed them in a plastic bin. "Good ones don't usually come back from suspension. But you," she glanced at Natalie. "You might be different." From his office window on the 4th floor, Dr. Pierce watched the security escort guide Natalie toward the parking garage. His expression carried the satisfied weight of a man who'd successfully removed an obstacle. She was leaving St. Michael's with nothing. No job. No reference. No future in nursing, not with an investigation pending, not with the Texas Medical Board file he'd opened. He'd won. The rain started at 14:51. Not a light drizzle. Not the kind of rain that passes quickly. This was the kind that announced itself, that settled in, that made people reconsider their decisions to leave the house. Natalie sat on a bus stop bench 6 blocks from St. Michael's, the canvas bag with her personal effects beside her. Her locker had contained almost nothing: a spare pair of shoes, a phone charger, the photograph of her son in dress blues, and the folded flag. She pulled it out now. The fabric was cotton, treated with some kind of chemical preservative that made it crackle when she moved it. The flag had been presented to her at a ceremony in Arlington. The folding ceremony had taken exactly 13 minutes. She remembered because she'd counted. The same way she'd counted the seconds the IED took to detonate in the Hindu Kush. The same way she'd been counting seconds ever since. The bus was late. 23 minutes late. She watched the headlights approach in the darkness, watched them slow, and then watched the bus pass her without stopping. The driver had seen the rain on her face and decided she couldn't board. Or maybe he'd seen something else. Maybe he'd seen the way her eyes looked at things. The way soldiers look at things after they've seen what soldiers see. Her wallet contained $84.37. Not enough for a motel. Not enough for much of anything. She'd been living on nurse's salary, decent money for most people, poverty wages for someone trying to disappear. She'd used her savings to pay for the apartment in cash. To buy clothes from second-hand stores. To become invisible. And invisible was what she'd been. Until she wasn't. The rain hit harder. Cold. Coming down like machine gun fire on the pavement. She pulled the flag closer, the flag that bore her son's name and the names of 17 other soldiers who died that day. A stranger offered an umbrella from a nearby bus shelter. She declined without looking at him. He left anyway, placing the umbrella on the bench beside her before walking away. She left it there, rain streaming off the nylon, soaking the bench. Her phone had 6 missed calls. All from the hospital. All blocked after the 3rd one. No messages. No voicemails asking her to reconsider. Just the administrative machinery grinding, documentation being completed, the process of erasure entering its final stages. She held the flag and thought about letting it fall. Letting it land in the gutter where the rain had accumulated, where leaves and trash were gathering. She thought about how it would feel to finally be rid of it. To stop carrying her son's death like a wound that wouldn't close. To stop being the thing that kept her in the fight, in the hospital, in San Antonio, in a place where a general who'd sent him to die was now breathing because her hands remembered something her mind had spent 18 months trying to forget. Her fingers were shaking. Not from cold. Not from fear. From something older. From the tremor that comes from holding power in check. From restraint. Her training had taught her that soldiers don't cry. Soldiers don't break. Soldiers don't sit on bus benches in the rain and consider letting go of the one thing that proves their son existed. She was about to do it. She was about to release the flag and watch it fall. And that's when she heard it. The sound came from behind her first, a distant thrumming that made the air pressure change. Then the red and blue emergency lights appeared through the rain, multiple vehicles, moving fast. Not an ambulance. Not police. Something bigger. Something with the kind of authority that made the rain seem to pause in its descent. The headlights swept across the parking lot. The vehicle slowed. And for the first time in 8 months, Natalie Hayes heard a voice that wasn't from the hospital. Wasn't from civilians. A voice that came through a radio with military clarity. Echoes 1 to Point Guard. Location confirmed. Movement verified. The first vehicle was a black Suburban with government plates. The second was an unmarked sedan. The third had enough antenna to communicate with 3 continents. She didn't move. Didn't stand. Didn't do anything except sit there with the flag on her lap while the vehicle surrounded her and the rain continued falling like judgment. A man in a suit exited the lead Suburban. He moved like someone who'd spent 30 years in the Defense Intelligence Agency. His eyes swept across her with the efficiency of someone performing a facial recognition scan. Behind him, the second vehicle opened, and a Marine officer emerged. Captain. Full dress blues despite the weather. Behind him came another figure. A helicopter descended toward the hospital parking lot like something from a memory she'd worked very hard to suppress. The DIA officer approached her bench. Captain Hayes. Not a question. A confirmation of identity that meant her file had been open the entire time she'd been in San Antonio. Natalie looked up at him. The rain dripped from her hair. She said nothing. Your patient, General William Marsh, regained consciousness at 11:38 this morning. His first question was, "Where's the nurse?" The general's eyes opened fully at 1,143 hours on the second day after surgery. His gaze swept the room, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, for lines hanging like mechanical vines, the morning light slanting across antiseptic tile. And then he saw her. Natalie Hayes, being escorted by Security Director Chen toward her locker, a cardboard box balanced against her hip. The general's hand moved first, fingers curling toward the Marine captain standing at his bedside. Valkyrie, he whispered. The word hung in the air like a held breath. The captain's spine went rigid. His face drained of color. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the ventilator's steady wheeze and the distant percussion of a defibrillator charging down the hallway. The captain's hand shook as he reached for the general's personal file. Military issue folder. Classified markings faded but still visible. His voice cracked when he began reading aloud, Captain Natalie Hayes, Marine Corps Special Operations Command. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during Operation Copper Summit. Citation reads, for extraordinary heroism displayed while maintaining a combat aid station for 11 consecutive hours under sustained enemy fire in the Hindu Kush Mountains, providing emergency medical intervention to 47 wounded personnel despite 3 direct mortar hits to her position, and extracting said personnel through hostile territory under cover of darkness. The captain looked up. Looked at Natalie. Looked back at the citation. General, this woman just performed an unauthorized surgical procedure, Dr. Pierce announced, storming through the doorway with a folder waving like a weapon. His face was flushed. His voice had that quality it took on when he was about to destroy something. I have documentation here. Forged credentials. Discrepancies in her nursing license. As you can see, the metadata shows clear. Step back, doctor, the general said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind of voice that had directed combat operations across 3 continents. The general's weakened state evaporated. What remained was the commanding officer who had pinned medals on the chests of soldiers who didn't flinch. Pierce froze halfway into the room, folder still raised, his mouth still open. The general nodded once to his aide, a Marine staff sergeant with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. One phone call. That's all it took. The aide stepped into the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, speaking quietly into the receiver in the clipped cadence of active duty. Quantico. This is Colonel Marsh's aide. Stand by for Priority 1 authentication on a compromised asset. 23 minutes elapsed. The FBI agents arrived in pairs, 2 through the main entrance, 2 from the stairwell. No uniforms. No ceremonial dress. Just dark suits and badges that flashed like lightning in the fluorescent lighting. Their boots on the tile made a sound like a countdown. Pierce's superior, the hospital's chief medical officer, watched them approach with the expression of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. The senior FBI agent opened the file in Pierce's hands before Pierce could move. Photographs of the forged license. The digital fingerprints visible in the metadata like bloodstains. The timestamp on the file showed it had been created at 08:07 that morning. 7 hours before the general regained consciousness. Who created this? The agent asked. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. There must be a mistake. This nurse, she's not. Doctor, the captain interrupted. You're done talking. A Pentagon courier arrived at 1612 hours. Olive drab briefcase. Credentials that made the hospital security team step aside without asking questions. The courier handed Pierce's superior a single dossier. Heavy paper. Classified letterhead. One word, handwritten in the margins, Valkyrie. The color left Pierce's face. His hands began to tremble, actual trembling, the kind that comes from recognizing that the ground beneath you has dissolved. I was just protecting the hospital. She shouldn't have been in the OR. There were protocols. You called the Texas Medical Board, one agent said, consulting a tablet. You contacted a private investigator using hospital resources. You fabricated documents. I was concerned. You inflated 17 patient billings by an average of $847 per case. 18 months of organized fraud. Insurance companies are currently reviewing claims totaling $3.2 million under your authorizing signature. The handcuffs came out at 1,738 hours. The ratcheting sound of metal closing around wrists is a sound designed to be heard. Pierce's voice rose to a scream as they walked him toward the door, past the nurse's station where every person stopped moving. Every eye tracked his passage. The chief medical officer turned away. The staff didn't. Security footage released to hospital staff at 18:51 hours showed what happened in the locker room 2 hours earlier. The video file was labeled for personnel review only, but it circulated through the hospital like oxygen, essential, unavoidable, everywhere at once. General William Marsh in his hospital gown, cotton fabric barely covering the surgical dressing on his chest. His boots polished despite the weakness in his legs. He moved to Natalie's locker with the precision of ceremony. His aide held him steady. The general's knees bent, a movement that clearly cost him, that made his face tighten with the kind of pain that exists in the territory between the physical and the profound. He knelt. His right hand rose in salute to the folded flag tucked in the corner of the locker. The Marine Corps colors. The white space where the name tag should have been, where the wearer's identity should have been declared to the world. But this flag was something else. This flag was draped around a photograph, a young man in desert camouflage, the kind of smile that exists only in the months before everything changes. Natalie stood at attention beside her own locker. Her shoulders didn't curve. Her face didn't collapse. But the tears came, not streaming, not theatrical, just there, present, real. Water running down her cheeks while her hands hung at her sides with the discipline of someone who had learned to cry without breaking. The general held the salute for 7 seconds. Then he stood, pain visible now, his aide's arm around his waist, and turned to face her. His hand came to her shoulder. No words. What words existed? He was saluting the flag of her son. He was kneeling before the woman who had held her son's body as he died 3,000 miles away and never spoken about it. He was acknowledging that she had saved his life with hands that had already buried theirs. Natalie's voice, when she finally spoke, came from somewhere north of the ground. "General." "Captain," he replied. "Welcome home." By 0600 the next morning, the story had moved beyond the hospital. Medical boards. Military channels. The Pentagon releasing sanitized statements about an honored service member returning to civilian life. The news organizations framed it as a human interest miracle. Decorated nurse saves general's life, gets vindicated after false accusation. They didn't know what she had really been. They didn't need to. Pierce's mug shot circulated by lunch. Federal charges, falsifying federal documents, insurance fraud, obstruction of justice. His bail was set at $200,000. He was booked into Bexar County detention and processed like every other white-collar criminal who believed the rules belonged to other people. By September of the following year, he was working at a community college in San Antonio teaching CPR fundamentals. The name tag read Steve. He flinched when anyone called him doctor. The salary was $18,400 per year plus modest health insurance. Nobody knew who he had been. Nobody cared. St. Michael's Hospital announced 3 months later that they were launching a dedicated veterans care wing. Pro bono services. A partnership with the VA. The hospital board also issued a statement about strengthening oversight of billing practices and physician conduct. The words meant nothing. The structure meant everything. Natalie was offered the position of Director of Trauma Services. Full authority. Her name on the door. The salary was $167,000 annually plus benefits. She declined. Instead, she worked night shift in the ICU. Exactly as before. The same fluorescent lights. The same monitors. The same rolling stretchers and the smell of antiseptic that lived in your clothes after 8 hours. But something had shifted. When she moved through the hospital now, people recognized her. Not because they knew who she had been, most of them didn't, but because they had seen the footage. They had seen the general kneeling. They had seen the flag. They understood that quiet people often held the most dangerous knowledge. A trauma resident named Delgado requested to work her shifts. Then another. Then 3 more. Within 6 months, night shift ICU had transformed into an informal training program. Natalie teaching them not just protocol, but something else. How to move under pressure. How to keep your hand steady when your heart was breaking. How to choose saving lives over saving face. One evening at the vending machine, the same vending machine where Pierce had mocked her 18 months earlier, a new surgeon caught her selecting a bottle of water. "You know people would follow you anywhere, right?" he said. "The respect you've earned here, it's not because of what people found out. It's because of what they saw you do." Natalie fed the machine a dollar bill. The bottle dropped. She didn't smile. "I'm not interested in being followed," she said quietly. "I'm interested in doing the work." She went back to ICU. She checked the monitors on 3 patients. She adjusted the PEEP on a ventilator. She held the hand of a woman whose husband was in the bed across the room, both of them clinging to whatever time remained. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint of a woman who knew how to operate in the darkness and had chosen to bring light to it instead. The restraint of someone who had already paid the price of being seen and had decided to spend the rest of her life making sure nobody had to pay it again. Scars tell stories. Some scars are visible. Most aren't. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever watched someone assume they knew your worth and been proven right by your silence, subscribe. Because the best stories aren't about the people who shout. They're about the ones who save lives in the dark and ask for nothing but the chance to keep working. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to know they're stronger than they've ever been asked to prove.